Afternoon and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. We have a very informative program for you this afternoon. For those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing a copy of this afternoon's featured book, The Last Million by David Nasaw. David was a longtime history professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center before retiring last year, and he's the author of several acclaimed biographies of William Randolph Hearst, Andrew Carnegie, and Joseph Kennedy. David's new book departs from biography, but it still reflects the same appreciation for the big picture, extensive knowledge of the subject, eye for intimate detail, and skill at multi-layered storytelling shown in his previous works. The Last Million is about the 1 million displaced persons who were stranded in refugee camps in Germany when World War II was over. Not only Jews who had survived the Holocaust, but Polish forced laborers and Latvian, Estonian, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian collaborators who either refused to go home or had no homes to return to. David describes how in dealing with this refugee crisis, humanitarian considerations often gave way to narrow foreign policy goals and Cold War calculations, and how the world responded in those several years after the war, David writes, set the pattern for what governments would do when confronted by other refugee crises in later decades. David's book has received glowing reviews. Publishers Weekly labeled it a must-read, and NPR called it insightful and eye-opening. So I'd encourage all of you to get a copy and also to put it on your list of holiday gifts. In conversation with David this afternoon will be Nicholas Lemann, a longtime journalist who's been a staff writer at The New Yorker for more than 20 years, and for a decade served as Dean of the Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, where he remains a professor. He's also written several books, including Transaction Man, published last year, which is a very engaging narrative history of the economic and social forces that have shaped our country in recent decades. And due out this week is another book of his, American Democracy, an anthology of historical texts intended to spur reflection and action on enduring problems of American democracy. And you can get the link for American Democracy as well, also in the chat column. So David and Nick, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad. David, hello. And I wanted to start and spend a considerable amount of time actually just kind of having you walk us through this book. Just to start, as Brad mentioned, you've written 3 in a row large biographies of American tycoons. This feels different. That's like an SAT question from our youth. But what led you to write this book?
I guess as a historian, I feel a responsibility to fill in the gaps in our knowledge and to correct the errors in our understanding of our past history. The common sense vision and version of the end of World War II was that the combat ceased, the Germans held up their hands, the sun began to shine, the sky was blue, and the suffering ceased. When we think about the post-war period, what comes to mind is that iconic photograph of the sailor kissing a stranger in Times Square and everybody throwing hats in the air and saluting one another. But that wasn't what happened in Europe. Europe was destroyed, devastated. Certainly Eastern and Central Europe and the Soviet Union were laid waste by the fighting on the ground and by the aerial bombardments. And when the war ended, there were 6 to 8 million refugees in Germany. There were prisoners of war. There were political prisoners. There were concentration and death camp survivors. There were God knows how many Eastern Europeans who had been virtually kidnapped by the Germans and brought into Germany to take on the jobs that had been abandoned by the young men sent to war. There were thousands upon thousands of collaborators. Some had done nothing more than worked under German supervision in the post office. There were others from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine and from the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, who had helped to round up Jews or who had joined the Waffen-SS to fight the Soviets. They ended up in Germany at the end of the war because they knew that once the Red Army reoccupied their lands, they were going to jail, they were going to the Gulag, or they were going to meet their maker. And there's a third group of refugees, and these are the Holocaust survivors. When as the war comes to a close, as the Germans realize that they've lost, that it's over, they want to hide all evidence of the death camps. And they burn the corpses, they bulldoze the remains, they tear down as much as they can, and they put the survivors in trucks and trains, or they death march them back to Germany, not to save them, but to work them to death. The understanding is, why gas these people when there's an ounce of energy still in them, and we can put them into mines and underground factories where no Germans will work, and work them to death. These were the groups of survivors who were left behind when the war was over. And it's the story, those who were able to walk, and the Western Europeans, the Belgians, the French, the English, they marched home again as soon as they were able. But 1 million, the last million, the title of my book, were left behind because they had no homes to return to, or refused for various reasons to accept the repatriation offered them by the Americans and the British and the Soviets.
Out of curiosity, do you have any personal connection to this story? Did you ever know any displaced persons?
I didn't before this book began. I have met not the displaced persons themselves, there are not very many alive, but I met their children and their grandchildren. And I knew growing up Holocaust survivors. And over the course of teaching for many years at the City University of New York, and being a historian, I've met, I had met a number of Holocaust survivors and their children. And one of the things that it never registered till I began this book, and it's one of the reasons I did begin this book, was that I realized that in talking to them, they had all arrived in the United States, or 80% of them, 90% of them had arrived in the United States in the 1950s, in the early 1950s. And it never, the question was why? Where were they? The war was in Europe, was over in May of 1945. Why was it that those who came to the United States didn't get here till the early 1950s?
So I don't think this qualifies as a spoiler alert item, but in the story you tell in the book, the world, shall we say, didn't welcome the last million with open arms. Why not?
The last million, these poor, homeless, in the beginning starving people who were left behind in Germany when the war is over and don't want to go home again, they are caught in the middle of what might be called the first battle of the Cold War. The Soviets And the leaders of the satellite nations, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Yugoslavs, they demand that the last million be returned home. Why? Because there are nations to rebuild. These nations had been destroyed during the war, and every able-bodied man, woman, and child was needed to go home again. The Soviets said, and they said this publicly, and they said it over and over and over again in the UN, in the press, they said any Ukrainian, Latvian, Belarusian, Yugoslav who doesn't want to go home either because they're war criminals and they're going to get punished, or because they're lazy. And they'd rather sit in Germany and be fed by the Americans, the British, and the United Nations than go back and work hard to rebuild their nations. The Americans and the British, for a variety of reasons, some humanitarian, some political, refused to repatriate those who didn't want to go home again. So the last million are caught. They're put into displaced persons camps, some behind barbed wire, and they remain there while the Americans and the British say, you don't have to go home, and the Soviets say, you do have to go home. And it's only after 3 years of this battle when the Americans and the British decide that we've got to start a new international organization, the task of which is not to repatriate anybody or to convince anybody to go home again, but to resettle these people in countries around the world that have labor shortages, that need these people. And that doesn't begin till late 1947, 1948, 1949.
What was life like in the displaced person camps?
The displaced persons were, remarkable human beings. If I had gone through what they had gone through, the Polish laborers and the Ukrainian forced laborers having been separated from their families for 5 years, working for the Germans or the Jews, I would have given up. But they didn't give up. They didn't give up. The Jews in particular called themselves, the survivors, they called themselves the surviving remnant, the last remnant. And they believed it was their responsibility not to mourn, to remember the 6 million, but not to spend their time mourning them, instead to rebuild a Jewish community, to rebuild Judaism. And, they did that, or they tried to do that. Each of the camps became a nation in exile. Mm-hmm. If you walked into the Latvian camps, you'd see sports activities, you'd see churches, you'd see schools, you'd see theaters. If you went into the Ukrainian camps, you'd see the same. And in the Jewish camps, they attempted to rebuild a people and to prepare for what came next, which many hoped would be Palestine.
In doing your research, how much was already known to you or others, and how much was there to be uncovered for the first time?
Oh God, what a great question. I'd like to say it was all uncovered by me and nobody knew anything about it, but that wouldn't be exactly true. There were only a couple of books. My book, there were 2 previous books that had been written way before on the displaced persons. There were books about the Jewish displaced persons, about the Polish displaced persons, about individuals, but no one had ever looked at the big picture the way I tried to look at the big picture. And no one had access. The earlier writers didn't have access to the materials I had. There was an abundance, an overabundance, a superabundance of materials. Steven Spielberg founded the Shoah Foundation, sort of the Shoah Foundation, and funded it. And the Shoah Foundation has interviews with Holocaust survivors, their families, and they all talk about the years of their post-war period. There are dozens of archives with oral histories, not only of the Jews, but of the Latvians and the Ukrainians and the Poles. And there are records of the debate that goes on in the United Nations, in the British archives, in the American archives. There are also any number of records in the Holocaust museums, the Jewish archives in New York, the Jewish archives in Cincinnati. And then there were the children of the displaced persons who I talked to. So there was a lot that no one had seen. And I don't think anyone before had attempted to do the big picture, which I tried to do in this book.
I found myself thinking as I was reading about the fights that we're having now about immigration policy. And I guess in some circles, it's tempting to look at the Trump administration and say that it's really out of the American tradition, which was very welcoming to immigrants. But, that's not the picture that emerges from the book. So the question would be, why didn't the US step up and say, we'll take the last million or a lot of the last million?
I think many of us feel that what is going on now with keeping out the immigrants is brand new. Now, that is not to say that the Trump administration, every week you read another stratagem employed by Donald Trump, who two of his three wives were immigrants and his grandparents were immigrants, or Stephen Miller, his major advisor, whose great-grandparents were immigrants, or Kushner, whose mother and father I talk about in the book, they were displaced persons. Their strategies to keep out everybody. But the United States has never been, certainly since the 1920s and before for Asians and Mexicans, has never been this welcoming nation that says, come in, we want you. The period that I talk about was particularly, and this I didn't know at the time, it's a frightening story. It's a disappointing story. It's a story that, I'd rather not tell, but, someone has to. When the war was over, and this sets the pattern moving forward, the United States, the richest nation on earth, believes that its responsibility is to feed and house and give medical care to the displaced persons, but not to offer refuge to any of them in the United States. It takes 3 years before Congress passes a Displaced Persons Act, which attempts to welcome some of the displaced persons. But that act is written in such a way that 90% of the Jewish displaced persons, 90%, are rendered ineligible for the visas that are going to be offered to the other displaced persons. Why? Because a coalition of Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans make the argument that they can no longer make a straight anti-Semitic argument. We don't want Jews because they're Jews. They say instead, we don't want the Eastern European Jews because they've been exposed to communism, and we suspect them of being communist sympathizers or communist operatives. Why? Because they were Polish Jews. And large numbers of them had been saved from the Nazis by crossing the border into the Soviet Union, right, and working hard, long, impossible hours for 4 to 5 years in the Soviet Union. They then returned to Poland, found the anti-Semitism in Poland made it impossible for them to rebuild their lives there. The only place they felt safe was in the displaced persons camps in Germany, guarded by the Americans. The congressman, and I've got the quotes, they say it in the congressional record, they say it in press conferences, they say, we don't want these Jews because they've been brainwashed. They were in the Soviet Union for too long. That even the death camp survivors and the Holocaust survivors, all of the vast majority, large numbers of Polish Jews, when they got out of Dachau, when they got out of Bergen-Belsen, the first thing they did was go home to Poland to try to find relatives, friends, someone. And then they came back to Germany. And the majority in Congress said, well, they went back to Poland. They knew Poland was communist. They stayed there a little while. We can't let them into this country.
Meanwhile, as you say in the book, one of the shocking things, two things that are shocking on that subject. One, that in some instances, at least, it was easier for Nazis to get into the US than Jewish Holocaust survivors. And the other is that some of the Jewish Holocaust survivors who went back to villages in Poland, et cetera, were then subjected to horrible pogroms.
Yeah, let's talk about the Poles first. Poland had been, I don't want to excuse anti-Semitism in the pogroms. I just want to understand it. I'm not the judge or the jury. I don't sit on high and condemn people. I just try to explain what happened. What happened was that Poland was entirely decimated by the war. I mean, the suffering, the destruction of the infrastructure, of the farmland, the loss of lives was frightening. Many of the Poles had taken over the property of the Jews when the Nazis took them away. They had taken their farms, they had taken their apartments, they had taken their small businesses, they had taken their factories. Now the war is over, the Jews return, and the Poles say, wait, we thought you were dead. You have no place here. Go home. Plus, all over the world, there is this ethnic nationalism that, Poland had been a multinational state. There were Ukrainians who lived there. There were Lithuanians who lived there. There were a large number of Jews. Poland, after the war, attempts to become Polish Catholic only. And the Jews are told there's no place for you, go home. And there are vigilante groups, there are militia groups that are formed to go after the Jews and to send them home. And there's story after story after story I read in the oral histories. There's a story, I'll tell you one, Bluma Domen came from a small town near Warsaw. And her entire family was sent to Auschwitz, and they were separated out. And as they were separated out, her father said to Bluma, when the war is over, said to the entire family, we don't know what's going to happen to us. When the war is over, everybody go back home. And those who are alive will greet the remainder who are alive. So Bluma goes home. And the first place she goes is to the Jewish Community Center in the post office, looking for some sign, some note, post-it note, or I don't know if they had post-it note, notes on the wall from relatives. She finds nothing. She goes back to the apartment where the family had lived, climbs the stairs, knocks on the door. Polish woman answers and says, no Jews live here anymore. And slams the door in her face. What is Bluma to do? She returns to Germany, to a displaced persons camp. The story about the war criminals and the Nazi collaborators is, again, not a pleasant story to tell. The worst part about writing this book was when someone would say to me at a dinner party, what are you working on, David? I would have to tell these stories. When the war is over, World War almost immediately gives way to Cold War. So what does that mean? That means the Soviets are no longer our allies. They are now our enemies. World War II is over. We won. Hooray. But World War III is on the horizon. And for World War III, you want as many violent, vicious, committed anti-Soviets, anti-communists as you can find. And what better group than those who had already fought the Red Army during World War II? So the horrors of Nazism were forgotten. And the war criminals and the collaborators remade themselves into anti-communists. Some snuck into the United States because they disguised their past. Others were welcomed. Not only scientists, but political leaders were welcomed into this country and put to work at the Voice of America, were put to work at the State Department, at the CIA, put to work preparing Americans to be more anti-Soviet and anti-communist than they were, and preparing Americans to fight a third world war, should it come to that.
Let's pull Palestine, Israel into this story, because it sort of runs as a thread through the whole book. And could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Truman is not a dumb man. Truman is a very smart, calculating politician. And Truman also has a humanitarian streak in him. And he does not want the Jews. He understands, he sends a delegation, he sends a man, Dean Harrison, to investigate the camps in the state of the Jewish DPs in July of 1945. And Harrison sends back a note and says, you know, we put the DPs in camps. We're treating them as badly as the Germans, but we're not exterminating them. You know, we've locked them up in displaced persons camps. And Truman gets in touch with Eisenhower and he says, we got to take care of the Jews. They don't deserve this. Truman also tells first Churchill and then Clement Attlee, you've got to open the gates of Palestine to these people. And Truman says to them, you don't have to worry about the Jews overwhelming Palestine now, because 6 million of them are dead. We're not talking about millions of Jews coming to Palestine. We're talking about a couple 100,000. And they've been through the ringer. They've deserved. Just open the doors, open the gates. And the British government says no. And it says no over and over and over again, because for the Brits, what is most important, they know they're going to lose India, they know they're going to lose their empire, they want to maintain ties with the Arabs, and if they have to sacrifice the well-being of the Jewish displaced persons, okay.
So did the book change your feeling about the Zionist project in general, and how could it have wound up in some different way? Was it an absolutely necessary thing, et cetera?
It's a great question. You cut to the chase here.
Mm-hmm.
I began the book. I'm Jewish. My family is Jewish. From Eastern Europe, I visited, in Latvia, the home of my grandmother's family. I had never thought much about Zionism. Of course, I wanted Israel to survive. But I was not a committed Zionist in any way. And I didn't understand it until I began work on this book. And it became clear to me that no country on earth wanted the Jews, wanted to take in the Jews. When labor recruiters were sent to the displaced persons camps after 1948, their first choice was Latvian workers. Why? Because the Latvians, having only come into Germany in 1944 and 1944 with their families, were in much better shape than anybody else. And the Latvians were 80% Protestant. And it was thought they were hard workers, they fit in. Nobody wanted the Jews. They were considered to be too clannish, not hard workers. They were considered to be unassimilable. So the Australians, the Argentinians, the Brazilians, and of course the Americans say no. When Truman pressures Attlee to open the doors to Palestine, Attlee says back, and the British Foreign Office has said back to the State Department and to Truman, how dare you tell us that we should open our empire to the Jews when you won't let a single one in? In the end, Truman, who naively believed that America was so strong and the British needed our help and our loans that we'd be able to pressure them to open their gates to the Jews, when he realizes that's not going to happen, and he realizes that in order to fight the Cold War, a independent West German state has to be formed, and it can't be formed while there are 250,000 Jews in camps there. And when he realizes that he's not going to be able to get the Jews into the United States, he becomes very much a Zionist. Mm. And he supports, again, the picture we have of Truman is, I don't think is the correct one, or it's a partial one. He supports the independence of his first partition, then the independence of Israel, not simply because he's read his Bible, as Clark Clifford said, or because, you know, he's a humanitarian. Those things might be true, but mainly he's got to get the Jews out of Germany. And the only place that they can possibly go where they'll be welcomed is an independent Israel.
I want to ask our audience to put some more questions in the Q&A, which you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's only one question so far, but I want to start responding to audience questions very soon. So please send us some more questions. But let me ask you, David, I mean, this is sort of a cosmic question, but something I'm sure you've thought about a lot through your career as a historian. You know, we all grew up on a very different story about World War II and the end of World War II. Why isn't this story that you tell that's so disturbing part of our national consciousness, our mythology about the Second World War?
I think it's a badge of shame in a way. I think it is widely known that the Americans didn't allow Jews into this country in the 30s, in the large numbers that they could have in the 30s and in the 40s. You go to any bookstore and there are books. There's a new book, and again, I don't remember the name, of letters by a German Jew begging family members to please get in touch with their congressman, let them out of Germany. So we know that's the case in the 1930s, and we know it's the case during the war. The debate about whether we should have bombed Auschwitz will go on and on and on and on, and there are no right and wrong answers to that question. But it's too much for us as Americans, I think, to recognize that when the war was over, we allowed the Holocaust survivors to remain in camps in Germany, the land of their murderers, for 3 to 5 years, unwilling to supply them, to give them a place of refuge. The State Department begged the Canadians and the Australians and the Argentinians and the Brazilians to take in some of the displaced Jews. And the answer was always the same. Why should we do it when you're not? And I think this portrait is just too frightening. We don't want to look at that moment in our past. We want to celebrate the end of the war. Look, this is, we talk about this as the good war.
Right.
You know? We talk about it as the last time that Americans were all united behind our president in fighting this war, that there were few, if any, dissidents and those who didn't want to fight. I mean, the Declaration of War was passed, I think, with only Jeanette Rankin voting against it in the House. And she had voted against World War I too. She was a pacifist, but everybody else voted for it. And we don't want to take a good, hard look. We also, I think, as Americans, and maybe this is true the world over, we don't want to understand that wars bleed into post-wars, that the suffering doesn't stop once the soldiers have gone home, that the suffering continues, and it's the innocent, it's the civilians who suffer. And that's the case in Syria, that's the case throughout Africa, that's the case in Honduras and Guatemala, where there are gang wars going on, where there are civil wars going on. And that was certainly the case after the Second World War.
So here's a question, the first question in the queue, which sort of comes from this. Can you make recommendations on how you would apply the lessons you learned doing the book to our situation today, particularly with respect to transnational migration and refugees and so on?
Yeah, I would not argue that our borders should be open and everyone who wants to come let in. I think that's a non-starter for political reasons, for economic reasons, and for a variety of reasons. But our policy, our immigration policy, should be based on humanitarian concerns. We can afford as a nation to resettle large numbers of immigrants, and they will be assimilated. I was so shocked to hear, I know we don't want to move into politics, or shouldn't move into politics, but I did a lot of research at St. Paul in Minneapolis, because the University of Minnesota has an extraordinary collection of documents on immigration. And I was astounded at seeing Somali immigrants all over the place, having assimilated into the nation. And then our president goes and he says, you know, how have you let this happen to your wonderful state? It's a shithole, excuse me. How can you let this happen? Well, we can let it happen. We're a nation of immigrants. Yeah. So one, remember that we're a nation of immigrants, and remember our humanitarian roots and our humanitarian aspirations. That's number one. Number two, don't allow falsehoods and misrepresentations to determine immigration policy. The displaced Jews after World War II were not all, or most, or many. They were not communist subversives. And yet policy was founded on that misconception that could have been easily cleared up. The same is true today. Those attempting to come to the United States from the Middle East, from Mexico, from Latin America, are not gang members. They're not lazy. They're not murderers. They're not drug lords. They're not terrorists. Some might be, and they can be screened out, but the vast majority are not. And immigration policy has to be founded, one, on humanitarian concerns, and two, on facts, not fictions.
We go to another question. Were the American and British public aware of the battle happening between their nations regarding the fate of the DPs?
That's a great question. The Jewish communities were. The Jewish communities were. I don't know if the general public was aware. There was no attempt by the Jewish organizations or the immigration organizations in the United States to pressure the British. And if so, it would have failed. Most of the communications that went back and forth, I found in the Foreign Office. They were between the Foreign Office and the White House, the Foreign Office, and the State Department. And those were kept secret. And in those time and time again, the British said to the Americans, stop pushing the Jews as these special victims who need special help. Everybody suffered during World War II. And we're not going to give any special credence to the Jewish need for resettlement.
Let me go to another question. Are the records of the German DP camps difficult to obtain?
Yeah, the records are available, and there are books written from those records, and there's extraordinary material available. I, in the beginning, got bogged down in that, and I made the decision to, I devote one large chapter to what goes on in the DP camps. But I early made the decision, and I found some wonderful stories. I mean, the Jews, for example, in all the camps had intramural chess competitions and boxing competitions. And each camp had its own boxing champion. Leonard Bernstein was invited, young Leonard Bernstein was invited to the camps to give concerts. The Jewish camps, the Jewish camps had their own orchestras. The Latvian camps and the Lithuanian camps had huge choirs. They all celebrated national independence days, except for the Jews that didn't have a national independence day. And they instead celebrated biblical holidays and the liberation. At Bergen-Belsen, they celebrated the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. So there are wonderful records. There are also terrific autobiographies of men and women who worked in the camps for the United Nations or for Quaker relief organizations. And, you know, I made use of those. There's a rich literature.
There's some good press coverage that you quote too, on at least parts of this issue.
Yeah.
You may be picking out the good from the mass of the bad, but there's quite a few eloquent passages by correspondents.
Yeah, there are a number of the New Yorker, for example. The New Yorker sent Janet Flannery did a number of stories. Janae did a number of wonderful stories on what was going on in the DP camps. Collier's Magazine and Harper, but it was the New Yorker and the newspapers. They all visited the camps and they were reported back to the United States, usually upbeat about what was going on in the camps and how this poor bedraggled peoples had roused themselves and created little Latvias and little Polands and little Israels or little Palestines within the camps.
I have two questions about Latvia that I'm going to lump together. Number one, what happened to the Latvians who were not Jews? Number two, what did you discover concerning your mother's history in Latvia, and how many labor or concentration camps were in Latvia during World War II?
there were the Latvian Jews. One of the things I discovered is that more than half the Jews, the 6 million who were killed, are not killed in or not gassed. They're shot. They're shot in the killing fields, as they're called in Latvia. And most of the Latvian Jews, there were no need for concentration camps. In every major Latvian city, there were, for a brief period of time, ghettos that were formed, and all the Jews were forced into those ghettos. And then they were shot. I visited when I went to Latvia. I was in Vilnius, depending on what name you want to use for it. And it had an extraordinary, thriving community. Latvia was a multinational state. Everyone didn't, how can I put it? There was not a lot of intermarriage, and there was not a lot of hugging between the different religions and nationalities, but people got along. The war and the post-war were just dreadful. My grandmother left Latvia. Her family left in the 20s and the 30s. When the war broke out in Butramanis, where I visited, there was a census of thousands, a couple thousand Jews. When the war was over, there were 12. One of those, or two of those, fortunately, kept a census and did a little history. And there is a Jewish cemetery. Many of the Jewish cemeteries in Latvia were ripped apart by the Soviets. The Germans killed the Jews. The Soviets, after a brief period, moved in and began this assault on all religious institutions, including yeshivas, Catholic schools, temples, churches, and they bulldozed the Jewish cemeteries, took their headstones and used them as paving stones. One of the largest cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries in Latvia, was bulldozed entirely, and sitting atop it now is a Soviet-style sports palace. After the fall of the Soviet Union, with the independence of Latvia, some Jews began to return and attempt what was impossible during the Soviet period, and that is to create memorials to the fallen Jews.
Here's another question. Did those in DP camps outside of Germany, such as in Italy, encounter the same difficulties with getting into other countries?
Yes. 80%. My book is mostly about Germany. But if anyone has ever seen a pre-war Italian film, they were all shot at Cinecittà,
right,
which is this extraordinary facility. Cinecittà, when the war was over, became a DP camp. So there's very little, there's no memorial there, and there's very little resemblance, or you can't see any of the remnants of that camp. Ray Kushner's grandparents escaped into Italy and into a displaced persons camp in Italy. And whether you were a displaced person in Austria or in Germany or in Italy, you had the same difficulty getting into the United States. There was one brief moment where Truman, as almost as a gesture, brought some displaced persons. Roosevelt brought a couple thousand displaced persons and put them on a military base in Oswego. But that was the exception. That was the exception. In Italy, in Austria, in the United States, in Italy, in Austria, in Germany, the displaced persons remained for 3 to 5 years.
I'm going to read you another question. I know that much of the opposition to allowing Jews to flee the Holocaust during the war was in the US State Department. Was it a similar story in the post-war period?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Truman was told almost as soon as he took office, it's an extraordinary series of memoranda to him. Almost as soon as he takes office, he goes to Potsdam to confer with, he thinks with Churchill. Churchill isn't there very long. He's soon replaced by Clement Attlee, and with Stalin. And the State Department is so worried that Truman's going to say something to Churchill and Attlee, which he does, about opening up Palestine. The State Department says, look, it's too complicated for you, young president. You don't understand this. Keep your mouth shut. Stay out. Truman does the exact opposite. Truman can't stand and doesn't trust the State Department. And one of the first things he does when he becomes president is he invites Rabbi Stephen Wise to the White House, and they talk about the problem of the Jews. The State Department fought Truman tooth and nail. The State Department said, leave the British alone, it's none of our business. To Truman, you don't understand power politics, and you don't understand that if the British leave Palestine, if the Jews arrive, that'll be the opening invitation to the Soviets to move in. The State Department never quite gave up on that.
Here's another question. What can the world do to prepare for the tens of millions and possibly hundreds of millions of climate refugees we will see in the coming decades? Is there any way we can possibly prepare for the enormous magnitude of this coming crisis?
We can't prepare alone. One of the things that FDR does in 1943, before we were in the war, FDR had been in the Navy Department during World War I. And FDR understood that when the war was over, there were going to be millions upon millions of homeless, stateless refugees. So in 1943, in 1943, Roosevelt organizes, before there's the United Nations, he organizes what's called the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And he invites all the nations that are participating in the war and some who aren't, including the Soviet Union, to participate in what is nicknamed UNRWA. Because Roosevelt says and repeats over and over and over again, this is not a problem any nation can take care of on its own. It is an international problem, it's a global problem, and needs a global response. The United Nations, nonetheless, led the effort and contributed the vast amount of money. Our present president has done exactly the opposite. He's pulled out of all of the international organizations, reduced funding, and takes no responsibility for the global problem that whoever asked that question, it's a terrific question. So the first thing I would say is that we've got to again enter the international sphere. It's number one. Number two, it is not enough. We have to do more than simply set up camps for these people. As we set up camps for the refugees, we've also got to come up with a repatriation or resettlement strategy. It's not enough to feed them in camps. The Palestinians have now been in camps for 3 generations. God knows how long some of the Africans are going to be in camps.
We're getting to the end of our time, but I think this is one maybe you can answer in what time we have left, to talk about Dwight Eisenhower as he appears in your book, both before becoming president and after becoming president.
Yeah, Eisenhower is one of the good guys. You know, Eisenhower, when he realizes what's going on in the Jewish camps, he takes it very seriously, and he makes sure that the Jews have their own camps, that they don't have to share camps with non-Jewish. The Polish Jews don't have to share camps with non-Jewish Poles. The Lithuanians with non-Jewish Lithuanians who might have served as guards in the concentration camps or whose families ripped off or stole from the Jews. So Eisenhower understands that, and Eisenhower immediately sends in extra doctors. He sends in extra rations. He tells the Jewish communities, you will guard your own camps. We're withdrawing all the German guards. We're withdrawing all the American guards. The obverse is Patton, and Eisenhower eventually, he fires Patton. One of the, you can find it in the book, in Patton's diaries, he talks about the Jews as worse than animals. Eisenhower understands better than anyone else what the Jews have suffered and what they need.
And he even went to a service.
Yeah, it's a remarkable, and thank God for the historian. He went to the service with photographers and with a cameraman. So we see Eisenhower with Patton next to him walk through a displaced persons camp. And he goes into a Yom Kippur service. Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, I don't remember which.
Yom Kippur.
Is it Yom Kippur?
Your book better than you did.
Okay, yeah. You've read it more recently. He goes into this service and stays. And it's simply remarkable. And Patton is so angry. Patton says, how could you, in his diary, how could he have gone in to this airless, dirty room with these dirty Jews? And Patton says, the first thing I had to do on leaving was take a shower. Eisenhower went, stayed.
I've got one more in the queue, and it's really a comment. So maybe you have a comment on this comment, and this will be the last one. The Soviet decree for the Jews to go home seems to be insensitive even for them. The Kremlin was well aware of the statelessness of the Jews from former Nazi-occupied territories.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that the Soviets were frightened, and I talk about this in my book. The Soviets were frightened. They believed the Americans were keeping all these Eastern Europeans in these camps to serve as a reserve army should their Cold War turn hot. The Soviets knew that after World War I, the Allies tried to overthrow the Bolshevik government. And they thought it was possible that the Allies would try to do that again. Having said that, the Soviets restricted all freedoms or any number of freedoms in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, and in Poland. And there were tens of thousands of displaced persons who refused to return because they knew they had suffered under Soviet occupation earlier, and they didn't want to return to that occupation, to that domination, to that lack of freedom.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Jews, right?
Correct, absolutely.
Okay, well, that's our questions. Welcome back, Brad.
Hey, Nick and David. Nick, great moderating, and David, congratulations again on a truly revelatory book. I mean, not exactly a feel-good history, but a vital and long overdue account of a critical period of post-World War II history that continues to have relevance today. To everyone watching, a reminder that you can find a link to buy The Last Million in the chat column, and Nick's new anthology too, American Democracy. Thanks to all for tuning in, and from us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.